before towering stone beacons stood watch over the world's coastlines, before enormous glass lenses sent brilliant flashes across the sea, before lighthouse keepers spent lonely nights tending lamps through fierce storms, there was only darkness. For most of human history, the ocean became an entirely different place once the sun slipped below the horizon. During the day, sailors could navigate by familiar landmarks. They recognized cliffs, mountains, river mouths, and distinctive stretches of coastline. Even without detailed maps, experienced captains learned to read the land almost as easily as a traveler follows a familiar road. But as daylight faded, those landmarks slowly disappeared. The shoreline dissolved into a single dark line. Mountains blended into the night sky. Even a harbor that had welcomed ships safely for generations became nearly impossible to recognize. Without moonlight, the sea itself seemed endless. Imagine standing aboard a wooden ship more than 2,000 years ago. The gentle sound of waves brushes against the hull. A cool breeze carries the smell of salt through the air. Above you, thousands of stars shine brightly, far more than most of us ever see today. Yet, despite their beauty, those stars cannot reveal what lies just beneath the surface of the water. Hidden reefs, jagged rocks, treacherous sandbars, steep cliffs, entire fleets could be lost simply because they arrived a few hours too late. Long before compasses became common in Europe, long before accurate clocks made precise navigation possible, long before satellites could pinpoint a ship's exact location anywhere on Earth, sailors relied almost entirely upon memory, experience, and the natural world. The position of the stars, the direction of the wind, the movement of waves, the color of the water, even the flight of seabirds could provide valuable clues that land was nearby. Navigation was never an exact science. It was a skill learned over decades. Every voyage carried uncertainty. Every captain accepted that the sea could be unpredictable. Because of these dangers, ancient sailors often followed a remarkably simple rule: avoid sailing at night whenever possible. Merchant vessels rarely crossed the open sea after sunset unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they hugged the coastline, stopping at beaches or sheltered coves before darkness arrived. Crews would anchor in calm water, prepare a simple evening meal, repair sails, and wait patiently for the first light of dawn. Sometimes they waited only a single night. Sometimes storms forced them to remain for days. Although this cautious approach slowed trade, it was usually far safer than risking unseen hazards in complete darkness. But as civilizations grew larger, patience became increasingly expensive. The ancient Egyptians transported grain across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians established trading networks stretching hundreds of miles. The Greeks carried pottery, olive oil, wine, and marble between distant ports. Later, the Romans connected an empire that surrounded nearly the entire Mediterranean Sea. Every day, countless ships carried food, timber, metals, textiles, spices, and precious cargo from one harbor to another. The more valuable commerce became, the greater the need for safer navigation. Waiting until sunrise was no longer always practical. Some ships simply had to keep moving, and so people searched for a solution. Not a complicated one, just a single point of light. The earliest navigation lights were surprisingly ordinary. There were no magnificent towers, no polished lenses, no carefully engineered lamps. Instead, communities built large fires on hills overlooking the coastline. Sometimes these fires burned from simple stone platforms. Other times they rested atop wooden structures raised just high enough to be seen from the sea. Their purpose was straightforward. They did not guide ships through every twist and turn of a harbor. They did not provide exact directions. They simply answered one very important question: where is land? To a sailor drifting through darkness, that answer alone could mean survival. A distant flame offered reassurance. It marked the location of a familiar port. It suggested that shelter and perhaps fresh water, food, and safety were close at hand. The fire itself demanded constant attention. Someone had to gather wood, and someone had to protect the flames from wind and rain. Someone had to remain awake while others slept. These anonymous caretakers became the earliest predecessors of the lighthouse keepers who would one day spend lifetimes tending far grander lights. As coastal settlements expanded, some of these beacon fires became permanent features. Harbors that welcomed frequent visitors kept watchfires burning night after night. Others lit them only during storms or periods of poor visibility. Even these modest fires represented something remarkable. They were among humanity's earliest public safety systems. No one built them for wealth alone. No one maintained them for glory. They existed because strangers sailing unseen across dark waters needed help finding their way home. Over time, these simple beacons became brighter, stronger, more reliable. Communities realized that placing a fire higher above the shoreline allowed it to be seen from much farther away. Stone platforms replaced wooden ones, watchtowers gradually became taller. Each generation made small improvements, rarely realizing they were taking the first steps toward one of history's greatest engineering achievements. Then, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, on a small island just off the coast of Egypt, a ruler decided that a simple hilltop fire was no longer enough. He envisioned something far more ambitious, a beacon unlike anything the world had ever seen, not merely a fire, but a monument. A structure so immense that sailors could spot it from miles out at sea, a tower whose light would become famous across the ancient world, inspiring every great lighthouse that followed. Its name would become almost as legendary as the city it protected. The Lighthouse of Alexandria. For centuries, it was one of the most famous buildings on Earth. Long before medieval castles dotted the landscape, long before towering cathedrals reached toward the heavens, long before skyscrapers reshaped modern cities, there stood a single beacon overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, so remarkable that travelers journeyed from distant lands simply to see it. Its story begins not with the lighthouse itself, but with the extraordinary city it was built to serve. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great founded the city of Alexandria along Egypt's Mediterranean coast. Although Alexander would die only a few years later, his new city continued to grow under the rule of one of his generals, Ptolemy I Soter, who established the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Alexandria was designed to become something entirely new. It would be more than a military outpost, more than a port. It would become one of the greatest centers of trade, science, philosophy, and learning in the ancient world. Merchants arrived from Greece, scholars traveled from Babylon, and ships sailed from Phoenicia, Cyprus, Italy, North Africa, and lands even farther east. Its famous library would eventually house hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Its bustling marketplaces overflowed with grain, papyrus, spices, glassware, precious metals, and exotic goods from across the known world. As the city flourished, so too did its harbor. Every year, thousands of ships entered and departed its waters, and that presented a growing problem. The coastline surrounding Alexandria was beautiful but dangerous. Hidden reefs lay beneath the waves. Sandbars shifted with the currents. The entrance to the harbor could be difficult to recognize, especially during poor weather or after sunset. For a city whose prosperity depended upon maritime trade, a safer harbor was not merely convenient, it was essential. Around 280 BCE, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the son of Ptolemy I, commissioned an ambitious project unlike anything attempted before. The task was entrusted to a Greek architect named Sostratus of Cnidus. His challenge was simple to describe and enormously difficult to accomplish. Build a beacon that could be seen for miles across the sea. Not a bonfire on a hill, not a temporary watchtower, a permanent structure that would endure for generations. Construction took place on the small island of Pharos, just offshore from Alexandria. The island already occupied a strategic position near the harbor entrance. By placing the tower there, sailors approaching from almost any direction would see its light before they encountered the dangerous coastline. The finished structure was breathtaking. Although historians still debate its exact height, most estimates place it somewhere between 100 and 120 meters, or roughly 330 to nearly 400 feet tall. To people of the ancient world, this was almost unimaginable. Most homes stood only 1 or 2 stories high. Even grand temples rarely approached such heights. The Lighthouse of Alexandria dominated the skyline. For well over 1,000 years, it remained among the tallest human-made structures ever built. The tower itself was elegantly designed. Its lowest section formed a massive square base, providing strength against coastal winds and earthquakes. Above that rose an octagonal middle section, narrowing as it climbed higher. Finally, at the top stood a circular tower crowned by an enormous fire. Some ancient writers described a statue overlooking the sea from its summit. although historians continue to debate exactly what that statue depicted. What everyone agreed upon, however, was the light. Keeping that light burning was an extraordinary undertaking. Unlike modern electric lamps, the beacon relied upon a large fire fueled by wood and possibly resin or oil. Every piece of fuel had to be carried upward, day after day, year after year. Workers climbed hundreds of feet through the tower's interior, hauling heavy loads to ensure the flame never died. Some historians believe the tower contained a wide spiral ramp rather than endless staircases. If true, pack animals may even have assisted in transporting fuel toward the summit. Whether by people or animals, maintaining the fire demanded constant effort. The beacon became a symbol not only of engineering, but of human dedication. Even on calm nights, someone remained awake. Someone tended the flames. Someone ensured that weary sailors far out at sea would continue to see that reassuring glow on the horizon. During daylight hours, the lighthouse may have been even more remarkable. Ancient accounts describe polished bronze mirrors mounted near the summit. These mirrors reflected the brilliant Egyptian sunlight across vast distances. Although later legends claim the mirrors could burn enemy ships with concentrated sunlight, historians generally regard those stories as exaggerations. What the mirrors almost certainly did accomplish was far more practical. They made the lighthouse visible even when no fire was burning brightly. Whether under the midday sun or beneath a moonlit sky, the tower announced itself from many miles away. To ancient sailors, seeing that beacon meant more than reaching a destination. It meant relief. After days or weeks at sea, the light confirmed that they had found one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Fresh water awaited, food awaited, shelter awaited. The dangerous search for land was over. Over time, the Lighthouse of Alexandria became so famous that the island on which it stood lent its name to lighthouses themselves. The Greek name Pharos spread throughout Europe. Even today, the French word for lighthouse is phare. In Spanish, it is faro. In Italian, Faro. Thousands of years later, the memory of that remarkable structure still survives in everyday language. The lighthouse continued guiding ships for centuries. Empires rose and fell around it. The Roman Empire absorbed Egypt. Trade continued. Generations of sailors relied upon its light. But no building lasts forever. Beginning in late antiquity, a series of powerful earthquakes gradually weakened the tower. Each tremor damaged stone that had stood firm for centuries. Large sections eventually collapsed. By the 14th century, little remained of the once magnificent beacon. Centuries later, many of its fallen stones were reused in the construction of the citadel of Qaitbay, which still stands near the original site today. Although the Lighthouse of Alexandria disappeared, its influence never did. It proved that a permanent maritime beacon could transform an entire coastline. It demonstrated that governments were willing to invest enormous resources simply to protect sailors they would never meet. Most importantly, it provided a blueprint. Across the Mediterranean, rulers began to recognize the value of constructing permanent coastal beacons. No civilization embraced that lesson more completely than the Romans. As their empire expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, they inherited the idea of the lighthouse and transformed it into a network that stretched across thousands of miles of coastline. The Romans were builders. Wherever their empire expanded, roads soon followed. Bridges crossed rivers that had once divided kingdoms. Aqueducts carried fresh water across valleys. Harbors were enlarged, cities grew, and along the coastline, lighthouses began to appear. Unlike the Lighthouse of Alexandria, most Roman lighthouses were not intended to inspire awe. They had a far more practical purpose. They were tools, reliable, permanent landmarks that helped guide ships carrying the lifeblood of the empire. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire surrounded nearly the entire Mediterranean Sea. The Romans even gave it a name, Mare Nostrum, our sea. From modern-day Spain in the west to the coasts of Syria in the east, from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south. An immense network of merchant vessels crossed these waters every day. Some transported grain from the fertile fields of North Africa. Others carried marble from Greece, wine from Italy, olive oil from Hispania, glass from the eastern Mediterranean, timber from the forests of Europe. The empire depended upon these ships. Rome itself consumed staggering amounts of food. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of tons of grain entered the city each year. Without a constant stream of merchant vessels arriving safely, the population of the empire's capital would quickly face shortages. The sea was not simply a highway, it was Rome's supply chain. Protecting maritime trade became one of the empire's highest priorities. That meant improving ports, expanding harbors, constructing breakwaters, and wherever dangerous coastlines threatened sailors, building lighthouses. Some Roman beacons were simple stone towers standing at the entrances to busy harbors. Others rose from rocky headlands where hidden reefs had claimed ships for generations. Their appearance varied from province to province. Some were square, others circular. A few were built in several narrowing levels, echoing the famous design at Alexandria. Most were constructed from local stone, carefully fitted together to withstand constant wind and waves. At their summits, fires burned through the night. Like their Egyptian predecessor, these fires required constant attention. Wood had to be gathered, fuel carried upward, ashes removed, flames protected from rain and sea spray. Someone always remained responsible for the light. And although history rarely records their names, these caretakers quietly performed one of the empire's most important jobs. A single neglected fire could mean disaster. Without its guiding light, an unfamiliar captain might mistake a harbor entrance. A merchant ship could strike submerged rocks. Entire cargoes might be lost before reaching shore. For the people tending these early beacons, there were no dramatic battles to fight, no triumphal parades. Their work was repetitive, patient, often lonely, yet every successful voyage owed something to their quiet dedication. Some Roman lighthouses still survive today. One of the most remarkable stands in northwestern Spain, known today as the Tower of Hercules. It overlooks the Atlantic Ocean near the city of A Coruña. Originally constructed during the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, it remains the oldest Roman lighthouse still functioning as a navigational aid. Over nearly 2,000 years, storms have battered its walls. Empires have risen and fallen around it. Languages have changed. Kingdoms have disappeared. Yet the tower continues to watch over the sea, much as it did during the days of the Roman Empire. Far to the north, another remarkable lighthouse once stood on the coast of Roman Britain. Near what is now Dover Castle in England, a stone tower known as the Pharos still survives. Although only part of the original structure remains, it reminds us that Roman engineering reached even the distant shores of the English Channel. For sailors crossing between Britain and continental Europe, its light would have been a welcome sight after navigating cold, unpredictable waters. The Romans understood something that earlier civilizations had only begun to discover. A single lighthouse could protect one harbor, but many lighthouses working together could transform an entire coastline. Experienced captains gradually memorized these landmarks. One beacon marked the approach to a familiar port, another warned of dangerous cliffs, another confirmed that a long voyage was nearly complete. Long before maps became highly accurate, these towers formed a chain of recognizable reference points stretching across the empire. Even so, navigating at sea remained extraordinarily difficult. Every lighthouse looked much the same after sunset. Every beacon relied upon an open fire. From a distance, one light resembled another. If several harbors lay along the same coastline, distinguishing between them could be surprisingly challenging. Sailors relied heavily upon local knowledge, the shape of nearby hills, the direction of prevailing winds, the estimated distance traveled since sunrise, the stars overhead, the color of coastal waters. The lighthouse itself was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. For centuries, this system served the Roman world remarkably well. Trade flourished, ports expanded, new generations of sailors came to depend upon familiar lights glowing quietly above the sea. But history is rarely still. Beginning in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire slowly fragmented. Trade routes became less secure. Many great ports declined. Some lighthouses fell into disrepair as governments lost the resources needed to maintain them. Others were abandoned entirely. The chain of lights that had once connected an empire began little by little to fade into darkness. Yet the idea itself never disappeared. Even during Europe's uncertain centuries that followed, coastal communities understood the value of a light shining across dangerous waters. The towers might become smaller, The technology simpler, the kingdoms very different. But the need remained exactly the same, and in the centuries we now call the Middle Ages, a new generation of lighthouse keepers would inherit that responsibility, preserving one of humanity's oldest traditions through an age of castles, monasteries, and Viking ships. When people imagine the end of the Roman Empire, they often picture a single dramatic moment, a city falling, an emperor surrendering, a civilization disappearing overnight. History is rarely so simple. The Roman world faded slowly. Over generations, roads fell into disrepair. Trade became less predictable. Cities that had once bustled with merchants grew quieter. Governments that had maintained great public works found themselves with fewer resources and greater challenges. And along the coastlines of Europe and the Mediterranean, many lighthouses faced an uncertain future. Stone towers do not care who rules an empire, but they do require constant attention. A fire left untended soon dies. A cracked wall eventually weakens. A collapsed staircase cannot repair itself. Without workers to maintain them, even the grandest structures gradually surrender to time. Some Roman lighthouses were abandoned completely. Others simply became too expensive for local rulers to maintain. In certain places, storms and earthquakes accomplished what neglect had begun. Piece by piece, towers that had once guided generations of sailors disappeared from the landscape. Yet something remarkable happened. The idea of the lighthouse survived, not because great emperors ordered it, not because vast governments financed it, but because ordinary people still depended upon the sea. Fishing villages needed to find their way home after dark. Merchant captains still sought safe harbors. Pilgrims crossed narrow channels. Small trading vessels continued carrying wool, salt, timber, wine, and grain between neighboring ports. The ocean had not become any less dangerous simply because the Roman Empire had ended. If anything, it had become even more uncertain. Without centralized governments maintaining navigation aids across thousands of miles of coastline, responsibility shifted to local communities. In many places, the beacon returned to its humble beginnings. A fire on a cliff, a lantern suspended from a wooden frame, a brazier burning atop an old stone tower. These lights were smaller than the mighty Pharos of Alexandria, far less impressive than Rome's great harbor beacons, but to the sailor searching for land on a stormy night, they were no less important. Throughout medieval Europe, monasteries often played an unexpected role in preserving these coastal lights. Many monasteries were built near the sea, some overlooked dangerous stretches of coastline, others welcomed pilgrims arriving by ship. The monks who lived there followed lives centered upon routine, prayer, work, hospitality, service, keeping a light burning for travelers fit naturally within those traditions. Historical records describe religious communities maintaining fires or lanterns to guide ships toward safety, not because they expected payment, but because helping strangers was considered an act of charity. Imagine a monk stepping outside long after sunset. The wind carries the scent of the sea, the waves crash against dark rocks below. Carefully, he adds another bundle of wood to the fire. Perhaps he never sees the ship, whose crew notices that distant glow. Perhaps he never knows that a family returns home safely because of the light he tended that evening. His work remains anonymous, yet profoundly important. Elsewhere, responsibility often fell to fishermen, harbor officials, local nobles, or entire villages working together. Each community developed its own traditions. Some maintained permanent fires throughout the year. Others lit their beacons only when storms approached. Still others relied upon church towers or castle walls, raising lanterns high enough for ships to spot from offshore. These were practical solutions, built not for beauty, but for necessity. During the Middle Ages, maritime trade slowly began to recover. Italian city-states such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa expanded their commercial networks across the Mediterranean. Farther north, the Hanseatic League connected dozens of trading cities along the Baltic and North Seas. Ships once again carried enormous quantities of goods across increasingly busy waterways. With every successful voyage came renewed appreciation for reliable navigation. New beacons appeared. Old towers were repaired. Some ports even rebuilt Roman structures that had fallen into ruin centuries earlier. The technology itself, however, changed very little. A medieval lighthouse keeper would have recognized the work performed by his Roman predecessor. Fuel still had to be collected, fires still had to be protected from rain, smoke still drifted into the night sky, the brightest beacon remained nothing more complicated than a carefully tended flame. Oil lamps gradually became more common in some locations, particularly where suitable oils were readily available. Compared with an open fire, a lamp could burn more steadily and required less fuel. Yet even these improvements were modest. The greatest advances in lighthouse technology still lay hundreds of years in the future. Life beside these lonely lights was rarely easy. Many towers stood on isolated cliffs where fierce winds blew almost constantly. Winter storms battered coastlines for days at a time. Sea spray coated stone walls with salt. Wood for the fire sometimes had to be carried long distances. During particularly violent weather, simply reaching the beacon could become dangerous. And yet, those storms were precisely when the light mattered most. On calm summer evenings, experienced sailors could often navigate by familiar landmarks in starlight. During a gale, however, when clouds concealed the heavens and towering waves pushed ships toward unseen rocks, a single distant flame could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Perhaps that is why so many coastal legends began during this period. People who lived near the sea naturally filled lonely towers with stories. Some claimed ghostly keepers still tended abandoned lights. Others spoke of mysterious flames appearing on cliffs where no beacon had ever stood. Sailors passed tales from one generation to the next, blending history with folklore until the two became nearly impossible to separate. Whether those stories were true mattered less than what they revealed. People had come to think of lighthouses as something almost timeless, as permanent companions to the sea, always watching, always waiting, always shining through the darkness. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe was changing once again. Ships were becoming larger. Navigation was improving. Trade expanded farther than ever before. Soon, explorers would venture across oceans that earlier generations had scarcely imagined crossing. The age of coastal sailing was giving way to an age of global exploration. The humble medieval beacon would no longer be enough. The world was about to demand brighter lights, taller towers, and entirely new ways of guiding ships across the sea. The great age of lighthouse construction was only just beginning. By the 15th century, the world was beginning to feel larger than ever before. European ships ventured farther from familiar coastlines. Explorers crossed oceans that earlier generations had considered almost impossible to navigate. Merchants established trade routes stretching between continents. Every year, thousands more vessels sailed into waters that few people had ever charted. The sea had become busier and more dangerous. Larger ships carried more valuable cargo than ever before. Spices from Asia, silver from the Americas, tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean, silk, coffee, porcelain, timber, whale oil. Entire fortunes floated upon the ocean. Losing a single merchant ship was no longer merely a local tragedy, it could represent an enormous financial loss. For governments and trading companies alike, every ship that safely reached port protected not only lives, but entire economies. Once again, attention turned toward the coast. Harbors that had relied upon modest medieval beacons began constructing stronger towers. Old Roman foundations were rebuilt. Entirely new lighthouses appeared along cliffs, islands, and rocky shoals where shipwrecks occurred with alarming regularity. This period marked the beginning of what historians often call the Great Age of Lighthouse Construction. For perhaps the first time since Alexandria, engineers began asking ambitious questions. How tall could a lighthouse safely be? How could it survive violent storms? What materials resisted the sea best? How could its light reach even farther? One location in particular became the ultimate engineering challenge, a small collection of rocks known as the Eddystone Rocks. They lie roughly 14 miles off the coast of Cornwall in southwestern England. At low tide, portions of the rocks emerge above the water. At high tide, powerful waves crash over them with astonishing force. For centuries, sailors dreaded this stretch of coastline. Countless ships struck the hidden rocks. Many never reached shore. Building a lighthouse there seemed almost impossible. The sea itself appeared determined to prevent it. In 1698, an English gentleman named Henry Winstanley accepted the challenge. Unlike many engineers of his time, Winstanley possessed both imagination and confidence in abundance. His lighthouse was unlike anything seen before, decorative, elegant, almost whimsical. It featured balconies, carved details, and elaborate ornamentation. It resembled a grand building placed improbably upon a lonely rock in the middle of the sea. Against all expectations, it survived several winters. Then, in November of 1703, one of the most violent storms ever recorded struck southern England. The great storm devastated towns across the country. Thousands of trees were uprooted. Church steeples collapsed. Hundreds of ships were wrecked. When the storm finally ended, the lighthouse was gone, not damaged, gone. When Stanley himself had remained inside while repairs were underway, neither he nor anyone else on the tower survived. The sea had reclaimed everything, and many people concluded that building a permanent lighthouse on the Eddystone Rocks simply could not be done. But sailors still needed a light, so engineers tried again. A second lighthouse stood for several decades before fire destroyed it. Then came a third attempt. This time, the project was entrusted to an engineer named John Smeaton. Smeaton approached the problem differently. Rather than treating the lighthouse like a tall building, he treated it like a tree. He carefully studied the shape of sturdy oak trees, noticing how their trunks widened near the base before gradually narrowing upward. That graceful curve allowed them to withstand powerful winds year after year. Why, he wondered, should a lighthouse be any different? Completed in 1759, Smeaton's lighthouse introduced a revolutionary design. Its curved profile allowed waves to flow around the structure rather than striking it with full force. Its massive granite blocks were carefully interlocked, almost like pieces of an enormous stone puzzle. Each block helped secure the next. The entire tower behaved as a single unified structure. It proved astonishingly successful. Smeaton's design became one of the most influential engineering achievements in lighthouse history. Even today, many modern lighthouse towers still echo the elegant curve he pioneered more than 2.5 centuries ago. Elsewhere, similar innovations appeared across Europe. France expanded its coastal network. The Netherlands protected busy commercial ports. Scotland erected towers along its rugged shores. The young United States, recognizing the importance of maritime trade after independence, soon began constructing lighthouses of its own. By the late 18th century, hundreds of beacons stood watch over coastlines that had once been almost entirely dark. Yet despite these remarkable advances, one problem stubbornly remained: the light itself. Building taller towers certainly helped. A higher light could be seen from farther away because of the Earth's curvature. Brighter fires also improved visibility. Some keepers experimented with coal instead of wood. Others burned whale oil. Later, vegetable oils and specially designed lamps produced steadier flames, but all of these improvements shared the same limitation. Much of the light simply disappeared. A flame radiates in every direction, upward, sideways, backward. Only a fraction actually traveled toward the open sea where sailors needed it most. Imagine lighting a candle in a dark room. Its glow fills the space gently, pleasantly, but if your goal were to illuminate a distant mountain several miles away, most of that light would be wasted. Lighthouse keepers faced exactly the same challenge. For centuries, they made the fire larger, fed it better fuel, raised it higher above the water, yet they still lacked a reliable way to gather that light and project it efficiently across the horizon. The solution would not come from building an even bigger fire, nor from constructing an even taller tower. Instead, it would come from an extraordinary piece of glass, an invention so ingenious that it transformed every lighthouse on Earth. A lens unlike any the world had seen before, designed by a quiet French physicist whose work would allow a single lamp to shine farther than anyone had once thought possible. His name was Augustin Jean Fresnel, and with his invention, the modern lighthouse would truly begin. For thousands of years, lighthouse builders had focused on the same basic idea: build higher, burn brighter, hope the light travels farther. It was a sensible approach. A larger fire produced more light. A taller tower placed that light above the horizon, allowing sailors to see it from greater distances. Yet there was a problem that no amount of extra fuel could solve. Light naturally spreads outward. Imagine placing a single candle in the center of a room. Its glow reaches every wall, the ceiling, the floor. It shines in every direction at once. A lighthouse flame behaved exactly the same way. only a small portion of its light actually traveled toward the sea. Much of it illuminated the lantern room itself. Some escaped into the night sky, some reflected back into the tower. The vast majority was simply wasted. For centuries, lighthouse keepers compensated by making their fires larger. Coal replaced wood in many places. Whale oil produced brighter, steadier flames. Specially designed lamps burned more efficiently than open fires. Reflective metal mirrors helped redirect some of the light toward the horizon. Each improvement made a difference, but none solved the underlying problem. The lighthouse was producing plenty of light, it simply wasn't using it very efficiently. Then, in the early 19th century, a young French engineer approached the problem from an entirely different direction. His name was Augustin Jean Fresnel. Born in France in 1788, Fresnel showed an early talent for mathematics and engineering. He lived during a remarkable period of scientific discovery. Steam engines were transforming industry, chemistry was advancing rapidly. Engineers were building bridges unlike any the world had seen before. At the same time, scientists were beginning to understand something that had puzzled humanity for centuries. What exactly is light? Fresnel devoted much of his career to answering that question. His work helped demonstrate that light behaves like a wave, an idea that dramatically improved the scientific understanding of optics. Yet the achievement for which he is most remembered began with a practical question rather than a theoretical one. How could a lighthouse shine farther without requiring an impossibly large lamp? At first glance, the answer seemed obvious. Use a bigger lens. Magnifying glasses can concentrate light. Surely an enormous lens could gather nearly all of a lighthouse's light and project it toward the sea. There was only one difficulty. An ordinary glass lens large enough for a lighthouse would be enormous. Not merely wide, but incredibly thick. The center of such a lens might weigh several tons. Supporting that much glass high inside a lighthouse tower would be extraordinarily difficult. Even manufacturing it would challenge the technology of the time. Fresnel realized that much of the glass inside a traditional lens wasn't actually doing very much. The important work happened at the carefully curved surface. The thick interior added weight, but contributed surprisingly little to bending the light, so he asked an elegant question. What if the unnecessary glass simply disappeared? Imagine taking a conventional magnifying glass. Now imagine slicing it into many thin rings. Each ring still contains the important curved surface that bends the light. Now slide those rings closer together. The result looks nothing like an ordinary lens. Instead of one thick piece of glass, it becomes a series of precisely shaped concentric circles. Light passing through each section bends almost exactly as it would in a massive traditional lens. Yet the finished lens weighs only a fraction as much. This brilliant design became known as the Fresnel lens. At first glance, it appears almost delicate. Up close, however, it is astonishingly complex. Hundreds of carefully crafted glass prisms surround a central lens. Each prism captures light that would otherwise be lost, and together they gather nearly every ray produced by the lamp. Instead of allowing that light to scatter in all directions, they send it outward in one brilliant beam. The improvement was extraordinary. Without increasing the brightness of the flame itself, lighthouse visibility increased dramatically. Some lights that had once been visible for only a dozen miles could now be seen from more than 20. Others reached even farther under ideal conditions. Suddenly, lighthouse keepers no longer needed enormous bonfires consuming vast amounts of fuel. A relatively modest lamp, combined with a carefully constructed Fresnel lens, could outperform fires many times its size. It was one of the greatest leaps forward in lighthouse history. The French government quickly recognized the invention's importance. Beginning in the 1820s, Fresnel lenses were installed in lighthouses along the coast of France. Other nations soon followed: Britain, the Netherlands, the United States, Scandinavia. Before long, nearly every major maritime nation wanted these remarkable lenses protecting its coastline. Manufacturing them became a specialized craft. Each lens required hundreds or even thousands of individually polished glass pieces. Every prism had to be cut with astonishing precision. Even a slight imperfection could scatter the light and reduce its effectiveness. Many of the finest lenses were produced by skilled glassmakers in France, whose craftsmanship earned admiration around the world. Lighthouse keepers treated these lenses with almost reverential care. The glass had to remain perfectly clean. Even fingerprints could slightly reduce the intensity of the beam. Dust, salt crystals, smoke from the lamp, all had to be removed regularly. Cleaning a large Fresnel lens could take hours. Keepers often used soft cloths, delicate brushes, and meticulous patience. One careless mistake might scratch a prism that had taken master craftsmen months to create. As beautiful as they were during daylight, the true magic appeared after sunset. Inside the lantern room, the lamp burned steadily. Around it, the great lens slowly rotated. Powered at first by intricate clockwork mechanisms driven by descending weights, much like an enormous grandfather clock, the lens completed its graceful revolution again and again throughout the night. To a sailor watching from miles offshore, the effect was mesmerizing. Instead of a constant glow, the light appeared to flash, bright, dark, bright again. The flashes seemed almost alive. Each rotation swept the concentrated beam across the horizon before moving on, only to return moments later. At first, these rhythmic flashes were simply a consequence of the rotating machinery. No one yet realized they had accidentally created something just as valuable as the brighter light itself. For the first time, individual lighthouses no longer had to look identical after dark. One might flash every 10 seconds, another every 20. One might show 2 quick flashes, another 3. Without intending to, engineers had given every lighthouse the ability to develop its own unique signature. And before long, sailors around the world would learn to read those patterns almost as easily as we recognize familiar faces. The language of lighthouse signals had begun. By the middle of the 19th century, lighthouses had become brighter than ever before. The remarkable Fresnel lens allowed a single lamp to project its light astonishing distances across the sea. To people standing on shore, it was a beautiful sight. To sailors, it was something even more valuable, a promise that land was nearby. But there was still one important problem. Imagine sailing along a coastline on a clear night. In the distance, you can see several bright lights. One belongs to a lighthouse. Another marks a busy harbor. Farther away, another lighthouse shines from a rocky island. Perhaps there is even a fourth light from a town beyond the hills. Which one should you follow? If every lighthouse looked exactly the same, how could a captain know where he was? For centuries, sailors relied upon memory, the shape of the coastline, nearby mountains, the estimated distance they had traveled, the position of the stars. These clues often worked well enough, but during heavy rain, dense fog, or complete darkness, even experienced navigators could become uncertain. A single mistake might place a ship miles away from where its captain believed it to be. As maritime trade expanded, that uncertainty became increasingly dangerous. The solution was surprisingly elegant. Instead of making every lighthouse brighter, engineers decided to make every lighthouse different. Each one would develop its own unmistakable identity, its own signature, its own language. Rather than burning with a steady light all night long, many lighthouse lenses began rotating at carefully controlled speeds. As the powerful beam swept across the sea, sailors saw brief flashes separated by periods of darkness. At first, these flashing lights were simply a mechanical consequence of the rotating lens. Soon, however, lighthouse authorities realized those flashes could communicate information. One lighthouse might produce a single bright flash every 15 seconds, another might flash twice in quick succession before pausing, another might display 3 flashes followed by a long period of darkness. No 2 neighboring lighthouses would share the same pattern. Over time, these flash sequences became as distinctive as fingerprints. Every important lighthouse received its own unique characteristic. Sailors learned to recognize them instantly. Imagine a captain standing quietly on the deck of his ship. The sea is calm, the night is cool. Far ahead, a bright light appears. He begins counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A brilliant flash, then darkness again. He counts once more, 5 seconds, another flash. Without seeing the coastline, without consulting anyone else, he already knows exactly which lighthouse stands before him. He reaches for his nautical chart, Printed beside the lighthouse symbol are a few simple words, flashing white every 5 seconds. The pattern matches perfectly. His position is confirmed. The lighthouse has spoken, and he has understood its message. As lighthouse systems became more sophisticated, several standard types of light characteristics emerged. The simplest was the fixed light. It remained illuminated continuously without interruption. These were among the earliest lighthouse signals and remained useful in locations where confusion with nearby lights was unlikely. Next came the flashing light. Most of the time, the lantern remained dark. Only occasionally did a brilliant burst of light sweep across the horizon. These flashes were usually much shorter than the periods of darkness between them. Another variation became known as the occulting light. Unlike a flashing light, the lamp remained visible almost continuously. Only brief moments of darkness interrupted the beam, as though someone had momentarily covered the lantern before uncovering it again. To an observer at sea, the effect was subtle but unmistakable, yet another pattern was called an isophase light. Here, the periods of light and darkness lasted exactly the same length of time, 5 seconds of light, 5 seconds of darkness, again and again throughout the night. There were many other combinations as well, groups of 2 flashes, groups of 3, long flashes, quick flashes, alternating rhythms, each carefully recorded in official nautical publications. Each designed to prevent confusion. The color of the light could also carry important information. Most lighthouse beams appeared white because white light traveled the greatest distance, but not every direction surrounding a lighthouse was equally safe. Suppose dangerous rocks lay just offshore to the north. Ships approaching from the east or west might remain perfectly safe. Only vessels entering from one particular direction faced immediate danger. Rather than building another lighthouse, engineers devised a clever solution. Colored glass. Sections of the rotating lens could be fitted with red or green panels. From safe waters, sailors continued seeing the familiar white beam, but anyone approaching the hazardous rocks would suddenly notice the light change color. Without a single spoken word, the lighthouse had delivered another message. You are entering dangerous water. Change course. These colored sectors quietly prevented countless shipwrecks. Even today, many modern lighthouses continue using them. Of course, none of this mattered if sailors had no way of learning the signals. That information came from carefully prepared nautical charts and publications known as light lists. Every lighthouse appeared alongside its unique characteristics, its exact location and its height, the distance its beam could normally be seen, and its color, its flash pattern, the interval between flashes, everything a navigator needed. Long before electronic navigation, experienced mariners became remarkably fluent in this language. They did not simply look for light, they interpreted it. Every flash carried meaning, every rhythm told a story. Yet despite all this ingenuity, there remained one enemy that no lighthouse could defeat: fog. A powerful beam might travel 20 miles across a clear night sky, but inside dense fog, its brilliant light could disappear after only a few hundred yards. Entire coastlines vanished behind thick gray walls. Captains sometimes knew a lighthouse stood nearby, yet could not see it at all. Once again, lighthouse engineers faced an old problem. Nature had found another way to hide the coast. If sailors could no longer rely upon their eyes, perhaps they would have to rely upon another sense entirely. The next great innovation in lighthouse history would not be something people saw, it would be something they heard, a deep, haunting sound rolling across the water, guiding ships through darkness when even the brightest light had disappeared. For generations, sailors trusted their eyes. A distant light on the horizon meant safety. A familiar flash pattern confirmed their position. A colored beam warned of danger. Night after night, lighthouses communicated through light alone. But the sea has always possessed a way of humbling even the most ingenious inventions. Sometimes the problem arrived quietly, a thin mist drifting across the water at dawn. Sometimes it arrived suddenly, a dense wall of fog rolling in from the open ocean, swallowing the coastline within minutes. To those standing on shore, fog can feel peaceful, soft, silent, almost comforting. To sailors, however, fog has often been one of the sea's greatest dangers. A ship might be only a few hundred yards from a rocky shoreline and never know it. Cliffs disappeared, harbors vanished. Even the brightest lighthouse beam could fade into a pale glow and then disappear entirely. A captain might know a lighthouse stood nearby. He simply could not see it. And so lighthouse keepers faced a difficult question. If light could not penetrate the fog, how could they continue guiding ships? The answer would come through sound. Long before sophisticated machinery existed, coastal communities experimented with remarkably simple solutions. One of the earliest was the bell. Large bronze bells were mounted near dangerous coastlines and rung at regular intervals whenever fog reduced visibility. The sound traveled farther than light under certain conditions and provided sailors with a rough indication of nearby land. Imagine standing aboard a sailing vessel in thick fog. The world beyond the ship has disappeared. The horizon no longer exists. Sea and sky have merged into a featureless gray curtain. Then, faintly, a bell rings somewhere in the distance. It's a slow, steady sound drifting across the water. You cannot yet see the shore, but you know it is there. For many sailors, that sound brought immediate relief. The bell did not reveal everything. It could not identify your exact position. It could not show hidden rocks or channels, but it confirmed that you were not alone in the fog. Someone was watching, someone was signaling, someone was trying to guide you home. As maritime traffic increased during the 18th and 19th centuries, however, bells revealed their limitations. The larger ships became, the farther away they needed warning. A bell that worked well near shore might become difficult to hear several miles out at sea, especially during rough weather. Engineers began searching for louder solutions. Some experimented with guns and cannons. At certain stations, keepers fired explosive charges at regular intervals whenever heavy fog descended. The reports echoed across the water with tremendous force. For sailors, these booming sounds served as audible landmarks. Yet the system had obvious disadvantages. Gunpowder was expensive, the process required constant labor, and repeatedly firing artillery throughout the night was hardly practical. More reliable methods soon followed. One particularly successful invention was the fog siren. Powered first by steam and later by compressed air, these devices generated sounds unlike anything previously heard along the coast. Deep, powerful, almost otherworldly. Some could be heard for more than 20 miles under favorable conditions. Entire communities became familiar with their voices. People living near the shore often knew exactly which lighthouse was sounding simply by listening. The most famous of these devices was the diaphone. Invented during the late 19th century, it produced one of the most recognizable sounds in maritime history, a deep blast followed by a lower, mournful note. The sound was often described as bee-oo, powerful at the beginning, almost haunting at the end. The call carried across miles of ocean, rolling through fog banks and storm clouds alike. To sailors approaching an unfamiliar coastline, it could be unforgettable. Imagine a ship moving slowly through dense fog. The crew can barely see beyond the bow. The sea seems endless. Direction feels uncertain. Then, somewhere ahead, a tremendous note emerges from the mist, a long, resonant cry echoing across the water. For a moment, the fog itself seems to speak. The lighthouse has found another way to communicate. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, fog signals became increasingly sophisticated. Just as lighthouse flashes developed unique patterns, foghorns did as well. One station might emit a blast every 30 seconds, another every minute. Some used groups of short signals, others employed long sustained notes. These patterns allowed mariners to identify individual stations even when visibility dropped to almost nothing. Nautical charts recorded these sound characteristics alongside the lighthouse's visual signals. Captains learned to recognize them. A certain sequence of blasts might indicate a harbor entrance, another might warn of dangerous shoals, another might identify a rocky island far offshore. The sea had gained a second language, one spoken through sound rather than light, yet fog signals introduced new challenges of their own. Unlike light, sound can behave unpredictably. Wind affects it, temperature affects it, humidity affects it. Under some conditions, a foghorn might travel astonishing distances. Under others, it could seem strangely faint despite being relatively close. Sailors occasionally reported hearing signals from unexpected directions as sound waves bent and reflected through layers of air. A lighthouse keeper could operate his equipment perfectly and still find that nature had altered the message before it reached the listener. Even so, fog signals saved countless lives. For generations, they served as an essential backup whenever visibility disappeared, and they required their own dedicated caretakers. Operating many early fog systems was demanding work. Steam-powered sirens required boilers. Boilers required fuel. Compressed air systems required machinery. Machinery required maintenance. During periods of heavy fog, keepers sometimes worked around the clock to ensure everything functioned correctly. A failure during poor weather could leave an entire stretch of coastline dangerously unprotected. As technology advanced, fog signals became larger and more reliable. Some stations installed enormous compressed air systems housed in separate buildings. Others constructed distinctive fog signal towers whose sole purpose was projecting sound across the sea. The voices of these stations became familiar companions to coastal communities. Children grew up hearing them, fishermen timed their work around them, residents often remarked upon their absence whenever the machinery fell silent. By the early 20th century, many coastlines possessed both visual and audible navigation systems working together: a bright beacon for clear nights, a powerful fog signal for poor visibility, each supporting the other, each extending the reach of the lighthouse beyond what earlier generations could have imagined. Yet, despite all these improvements, the most important part of every lighthouse remained neither the tower, nor the lens, nor the foghorn. Behind every light and every signal stood a human being. Someone who climbed the tower each evening, someone who cleaned the lenses, someone who maintained the machinery, someone who remained awake while others slept. For centuries, the history of lighthouses had also been the history of the people who cared for them. And among all maritime professions, few lives were as isolated or as fascinating as that of the lighthouse keeper. For all the remarkable inventions that transformed lighthouses over the centuries, the towering stone walls, the brilliant Fresnel lenses, the powerful foghorns, none of them could function without one essential ingredient: a person. For most of lighthouse history, every light depended upon someone willing to devote their life to keeping it alive. Long before electricity and automation, a lighthouse keeper was far more than a caretaker. He was an engineer, a mechanic, a weather observer, a cleaner, a record keeper, sometimes even a rescuer. And although thousands of men and later many women served in these roles across the world, their work often went unnoticed. If they performed their duties perfectly, nothing happened. Ships arrived safely, harbors remained busy, lives were saved without anyone realizing how close disaster might have been. The greatest compliment a lighthouse keeper could receive was silence: no shipwreck, no accident, no headline in the newspaper, only another ordinary morning after another successful night. The work itself was demanding, far more demanding than many people imagine. A lighthouse did not simply switch itself on at sunset. Hours before darkness arrived, preparations began. The lamp had to be inspected, fuel levels checked, glass polished until it sparkled, every fingerprint removed, every trace of soot carefully wiped away. The magnificent Fresnel lens demanded constant attention. Its hundreds of precisely cut glass prisms had to remain perfectly clean. Even a thin layer of salt left behind by ocean spray could slightly reduce the brightness of the beam. Dust collected quickly. Smoke from the lamp settled onto the glass. Every day, the keeper climbed into the lantern room carrying soft cloths, brushes, and cleaning solutions, patiently restoring every surface. It was meticulous work. There was no room for carelessness. A scratch in the lens might remain there for decades. As evening approached, the keeper lit the lamp. In earlier centuries, that meant kindling an open fire. Later, it involved carefully trimmed oil lamps, fueled by whale oil, colza oil, kerosene, or other fuels, depending upon the era and the location. Lighting the lamp was only the beginning. Throughout the night, it required constant supervision. The flame had to burn steadily, not too high, not too low. If the wick became uneven, smoke could darken the chimney glass. If the fuel supply ran low, the light might dim before sunrise. Every detail mattered. Many lighthouse lenses rotated continuously to create their distinctive flash patterns. Before electric motors, these rotations were powered by intricate clockwork mechanisms. Enormous weights slowly descended through the center of the tower, turning gears with remarkable precision. Much like an oversized grandfather clock, the mechanism eventually wound down. Every few hours, day or night, the keeper climbed the tower and wound it again. Some nights this happened several times. No matter how cold the weather, no matter how fierce the storm, the machinery could not be allowed to stop. If it did, the carefully timed flash pattern would disappear. Sailors who depended upon that familiar rhythm might suddenly find themselves uncertain of their position. The keeper's work rarely ended with the lantern room. Every part of the station demanded attention. Windows needed washing. Metal fittings required protection from rust. Stone walls had to be inspected after storms. Rainwater cisterns cleaned. Paths repaired. Boats maintained. Supplies inventoried. Even the flagpole often served an important purpose during daylight hours, communicating with passing vessels through signal flags. Many larger stations also cared for gardens. At first, this may seem surprising, but fresh vegetables were difficult to obtain on isolated islands. A carefully tended garden provided food while also offering something equally valuable: routine. Life at a lighthouse followed a rhythm that changed very little from one day to the next. Perhaps that predictability helped many keepers endure the isolation. Some stations stood only a short walk from nearby villages. Others occupied lonely headlands where the nearest neighbors lived miles away. The most isolated of all rested upon tiny rocky islands surrounded entirely by open sea for weeks, sometimes months. The keeper and his family might see no visitors except the occasional supply boat. Storms occasionally prevented those boats from arriving on schedule. Food had to be rationed carefully, fuel became precious, mail accumulated on the mainland. In extreme weather, keepers understood that they were entirely on their own. Despite this isolation, many lighthouse stations became family homes. Wives often shared the workload, cleaning lantern rooms, maintaining household gardens, educating children, and assisting with countless daily tasks. Children grew up surrounded by crashing waves and endless horizons. For them, climbing spiral staircases became as ordinary as climbing the stairs inside any house. Many later recalled remarkable childhoods filled with seabirds, seals, storms, and spectacular sunsets. Yet they also remembered the loneliness. Friends lived far away. School might require traveling by boat. Simple errands that most people took for granted became major undertakings. Still, many families grew deeply attached to lighthouse life. The tower became more than a workplace. It became home. Storms tested every keeper's resolve. During severe weather, waves sometimes crashed high enough to shake the entire structure. Windows rattled. Wind howled through every crack. Sea spray drenched walls dozens of feet above the water. Some offshore towers seemed to disappear beneath enormous waves before emerging again moments later. Inside, the keeper continued working. The light could not fail. Perhaps nowhere was his commitment demonstrated more clearly than at the Bell Rock Lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. Completed in 1811, upon a reef submerged beneath the sea for much of every tide, it quickly earned a reputation as one of the world's most remarkable engineering achievements. Its keepers endured violent North Sea storms year after year. During particularly rough weather, they sometimes described the tower trembling beneath the force of enormous waves. Furniture shifted, dishes rattled, the roar of the sea filled every room. Yet the light continued shining again and again, night after night. Lighthouse keepers also became careful observers of nature. They recorded weather conditions, wind direction, air pressure, sea state, visibility. Many kept detailed journals documenting everything from unusual storms to migrating birds resting briefly upon the tower. Today, some of these journals provide historians with valuable glimpses into daily coastal life stretching back more than a century. Perhaps the greatest challenge, however, was not physical. It was psychological. Imagine spending months surrounded by the same small group of people, or perhaps completely alone. The same rooms, the same staircase, the same horizon, day after day, week after week. Winter storms might prevent visitors for extended periods. Conversation became scarce. Entertainment was limited to books, music, writing letters, and simple hobbies. Many keepers developed remarkable patience. Others found comfort in routine. Some struggled with the solitude. Yet, despite these hardships, countless lighthouse keepers spoke warmly of their profession. They described extraordinary sunrises over calm seas, moonlight reflecting across endless water, whales surfacing offshore, flocks of seabirds circling the tower, moments of breathtaking beauty witnessed by very few people. There was satisfaction, too, in knowing that their quiet labor protected strangers they would never meet. Every safe arrival represented a success. Every ship that passed without incident justified another long night tending the light.
Over time, lighthouse keepers became respected figures within coastal communities.
People trusted them. Sailors waved as they passed. Children listened eagerly to their stories. Visitors admired the lonely towers without always appreciating the work required to keep them operating. But change was approaching. During the 20th century, new technology would begin replacing many of the daily tasks that had occupied lighthouse keepers for generations. Electric lamps required less maintenance. Automatic clockwork systems became more reliable. Radio communication expanded. Eventually, computers and remote monitoring would allow many lighthouses to function without anyone living inside them at all. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the light would continue shining, even after the keeper had gone. For nearly 2,000 years, the story of the lighthouse and the story of the lighthouse keeper had been impossible to separate. A light existed because someone climbed the tower, someone polished the lens, someone trimmed the wick, someone wound the great clockwork mechanism, someone stayed awake while the rest of the coastline slept. Every flash that reached the horizon represented countless hours of quiet human labor. But during the 20th century, something extraordinary began to happen. For the first time in history, the lighthouse no longer needed someone living inside it every day. The transformation happened gradually. Unlike the dramatic construction of the Lighthouse of Alexandria or the invention of the Fresnel lens, automation arrived one careful improvement at a time. Electricity was among the first great changes. For centuries, lighthouse keepers had relied upon flames. Wood fires, coal fires, whale oil, colza oil, kerosene. Every fuel required storage, every lamp required cleaning, every flame demanded constant attention. Electric lamps changed everything. They produced brighter, steadier light. They created far less soot. They eliminated the daily task of trimming wicks and cleaning smoke-blackened chimneys. More importantly, they could remain illuminated for long periods with very little supervision. The lantern room itself became cleaner. The magnificent Fresnel lenses sparkled without the constant haze of smoke settling upon their glass. Many keepers welcomed these improvements. After all, fewer hours spent cleaning meant more time maintaining other parts of the station, yet electricity alone did not eliminate the keeper's responsibilities. The rotating lenses still required attention. Mechanical equipment still wore out. Storms still damaged buildings. Fog signals still needed operators. The next innovation proved even more significant. Automatic lamp changers. Engineers understood that even electric bulbs eventually burn out. If a lighthouse depended upon a single bulb, a failure during the night could leave an entire stretch of coastline without guidance. The solution was surprisingly clever. Several spare bulbs were mounted around the primary lamp. If the main light failed, a mechanical device automatically rotated another bulb into position. Within moments, the lighthouse was shining again. Sometimes the keeper would not even realize the change had occurred until inspecting the lantern the following morning. The sea had gained another layer of protection. Soon afterward came automatic sun switches. These devices recognized the changing light of dusk and dawn. Without anyone climbing the tower, the lighthouse turned itself on each evening and quietly switched itself off again after sunrise. Tasks that had once required years of discipline now ping automatically. By the middle of the 20th century, many lighthouse stations had also adopted electric motors. For generations, keepers had climbed the tower every few hours to rewind the enormous clockwork weights that rotated the Fresnel lens. The work became so routine that many keepers could perform it almost without thinking. Electric motors ended that tradition. The lens continued rotating. Its familiar flash pattern remained unchanged. But the keeper no longer needed to wind the machinery throughout the night. One of the oldest rituals of lighthouse life quietly disappeared. At the same time, advances in communication transformed life at isolated stations. Earlier generations often waited weeks for news from the mainland. Letters arrived only when weather allowed supply boats to land. Telephones slowly reached many coastal stations. Later came radio communication. A keeper facing an emergency no longer relied solely upon signal flags or passing ships. Help could often be summoned immediately. Isolation became a little less complete. As decades passed, governments began asking an unavoidable question: if machines could light the lamp, rotate the lens, replace failed bulbs, operate the foghorn, and communicate maintenance problems, did every lighthouse still require a full-time resident? The answer increasingly was no. Beginning in the mid-20th century, lighthouse authorities around the world gradually automated their stations. Some keepers accepted new assignments elsewhere, others retired after decades of service. Some watched with quiet sadness as the towers they had cared for all their lives prepared to continue without them. It marked the end of one of history's oldest professions. The process unfolded differently from country to country. In the United States, automation accelerated after the Second World War. The United States Coast Guard modernized hundreds of stations, introducing electric lights, automated controls, and eventually remote monitoring. Canada followed a similar path, though some particularly remote stations remained staffed for many years because they also supported weather observations and search and rescue operations. Across Europe, long-serving keepers gradually handed responsibility to machines. Some stations closed entirely, others continued operating exactly as before. Except no one climbed the stairs each evening anymore. The buildings themselves also changed. Without resident families, many keepers' houses stood empty. Some fell into disrepair, others found entirely new purposes. Former lighthouse stations became museums, hotels, private homes, research centers, visitor attractions, places where travelers could spend a night experiencing the peaceful isolation that lighthouse families had once called ordinary life. Walking through these buildings today can feel strangely moving. The kitchens remain, the narrow staircases still spiral upward, the lantern room still overlooks the sea. Everything appears ready for the keeper to return, yet the rooms remain silent. The daily routines have ended. Even the great Fresnel lenses, once polished by hand every morning, are often preserved behind protective barriers, admired as works of engineering and art. Some have been moved into museums where visitors can stand close enough to appreciate the extraordinary craftsmanship of thousands of precisely cut glass prisms. Others remain exactly where they have always been, continuing their work after more than a century of faithful service. Of course, automation did not mean perfection. Machines require maintenance. Electrical systems fail. Storms continue to damage towers. Technicians still visit lighthouses regularly to inspect equipment, repair structures, and ensure that every beacon continues operating correctly. The human presence never disappeared completely. It simply became less constant. Today, many lighthouses are monitored from centralized control centers hundreds or even thousands of miles away. If a light fails, an alert appears almost instantly. Maintenance crews can often respond before most passing ships ever notice a problem. It is an astonishing contrast to earlier centuries when a keeper standing alone in a lantern room represented the only safeguard against darkness. Yet despite all this technological progress, many people still feel that something changed when the keepers departed. Not because the lights became less reliable, in many ways they became more reliable than ever before, but because the towers lost a certain human rhythm. Gone were the footsteps echoing up the spiral staircase each evening. Gone was the quiet ritual of lighting the lamp. Gone were the journals filled with weather observations and reflections on lonely nights beside the sea. The lighthouse continued its timeless duty, but it did so in silence and still. Even as satellites began orbiting the Earth, even as ships gained radar, radio navigation, and eventually GPS, the familiar beams continued sweeping across the water, which raises one final question. If modern ships can determine their position within a matter of feet using technology unimaginable to earlier generations, why do we still need lighthouses at all? The answer reveals that these ancient towers remain far more useful and far more meaningful than many people realize. At first glance, it might seem as though the age of the lighthouse has come to an end. Modern ships navigate using satellites orbiting thousands of miles above the Earth. Electronic charts display coastlines with extraordinary precision. Radar reveals nearby vessels even on the darkest nights. Weather forecasts arrive instantly. Computers calculate courses in seconds. Compared to the world of ancient sailors following the stars, the modern ocean appears almost effortless to navigate. So why, after all these centuries, Do thousands of lighthouses still stand watch over coastlines across the globe? The answer begins with a simple idea. Good navigation never depends upon a single system. It depends upon layers.
Professional mariners have long followed a principle that remains just as important today as it was hundreds of years ago.
Never rely upon only one source of information. Even the most advanced technology can fail. Electrical systems lose power. Equipment breaks. Antennas become damaged. Software develops errors. Signals may occasionally be interrupted. Although satellite navigation has become remarkably accurate and dependable, experienced captains continue verifying their position using multiple methods whenever possible. A lighthouse provides one more independent point of reference. It asks nothing from the ship. No batteries, no internet connection, no subscription, no complicated software. It simply shines. As long as the light remains visible, anyone can use it. Even today, navigators often compare electronic information with what they can actually observe outside the bridge windows. If the lighthouse appears exactly where the chart predicts, confidence grows, and if something does not match, it may be the first indication that further investigation is needed. There is comfort in confirmation, especially at sea. Many modern lighthouses also continue marking hazards that cannot easily be appreciated on a digital screen. A chart might indicate dangerous rocks. A flashing beacon makes those dangers impossible to ignore. A red sector light quietly warns that a vessel has entered unsafe water. A green light marks the safest approach toward a harbor entrance. These visual signals communicate instantly. No translation required, no electronic equipment necessary. Pilots guiding ships into unfamiliar ports still value these traditional aids. Commercial captains appreciate them, fishermen depend upon them, sailors navigating small recreational boats often rely upon them as reassuring landmarks after sunset. Not every vessel crossing the ocean carries sophisticated navigation equipment. For countless smaller craft, the lighthouse remains every bit as relevant as it was decades ago. Lighthouses also continue serving another important purpose. They help define the coastline itself. Imagine approaching land after several days at sea. The first thing visible may not be mountains, nor buildings, or trees, but a familiar beacon sweeping slowly across the horizon. Long before the harbor comes into view, the lighthouse announces that land is near. For many sailors, that first glimpse remains deeply emotional. It signals the approaching end of a long voyage. Home is close. Throughout history, countless journals describe the relief of seeing a lighthouse after difficult days at sea. That feeling has not disappeared simply because ships now carry GPS receivers. Technology can display coordinates. It cannot replace the emotional reassurance of seeing solid land again. Many lighthouse stations have also taken on entirely new responsibilities. Some now house weather instruments that continuously measure wind speed, wave height, atmospheric pressure, temperature, and visibility. Others support marine research, wildlife observation, environmental monitoring, communication equipment, search and rescue operations. What began as simple navigation towers have quietly evolved into multi-purpose coastal stations. Their role has changed, their usefulness has not. Beyond their practical value lies something more difficult to measure. Lighthouses have become symbols. Almost every culture with a coastline has developed stories about them, and artists paint them. Photographers wait patiently for storms to capture them. Writers use them as symbols of hope, endurance, guidance, and solitude. Children recognize their familiar silhouette long before learning how they actually work. Few buildings inspire quite the same affection. Perhaps it is because they represent something timeless. A lighthouse asks for very little attention and does not move, and it does not compete for notice. Night after night, year after year, it quietly performs the same duty. There's something comforting about that kind of reliability. Some of the world's oldest operating lighthouses have now guided ships for well over 2 centuries. Think for a moment about everything they have witnessed. The final years of sailing ships, the arrival of steam engines, the first steel-hulled vessels, the invention of radio, 2 world wars, the rise of aviation, the space age, the birth of the internet, satellite navigation. Through every era, the light continued sweeping across the sea. Generations of lighthouse keepers came and went. Families grew old, empires disappeared, technology transformed almost every aspect of maritime life, yet the lighthouse remained. standing patiently against the wind, watching the tides rise and fall exactly as they always had. Today, many historic lighthouses are lovingly preserved by local communities, historical societies, and volunteers. Some welcome visitors climbing hundreds of spiral steps to the lantern room. Others operate as museums, sharing the stories of the keepers who once lived there. A few have become overnight accommodations where guests can experience the remarkable quiet of life beside the sea. These towers no longer exist solely because ships require them. They survive because people value what they represent: history, craftsmanship, service, resilience, and the quiet promise that someone once devoted their life to helping complete strangers find their way safely home. In many respects, the lighthouse has outgrown its original purpose. It is no longer simply a navigational aid, it has become a reminder that some of humanity's greatest achievements are not always the largest, or the fastest, or the most complicated. Sometimes they are the ones that perform a single task faithfully for centuries. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the history of lighthouses has to offer. From the first watch fires burning on lonely hills to the towering pharos of Alexandria, from Roman engineers to medieval monks, from isolated keepers tending oil lamps through violent storms to automated beacons quietly monitored by computers, the goal has never changed: to offer guidance, to reduce danger, to help strangers reach home safely. That simple purpose has endured for more than 2,000 years. Few inventions can claim such a remarkable legacy. The next time you find yourself standing beside the ocean after sunset and you notice a distant light slowly turning across the water, you may see it a little differently, not merely as a beautiful tower, but as the latest chapter in one of humanity's oldest continuing stories. A story that began with a single fire burning quietly on a lonely hill, and whose light, in many ways, still reaches us today. And so, our journey through the history of lighthouses comes to a quiet close. Over the past hour, we have traveled across more than 2,000 years of history. From simple fires burning atop lonely hills, to one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, from the mighty ports of the Roman Empire to the windswept monasteries of medieval Europe, from ingenious engineers building towers upon storm-battered rocks to patient lighthouse keepers polishing great lenses long before dawn. It is an extraordinary story, not because lighthouses were the tallest buildings or the most expensive or the most complicated machines humanity has ever created. Their story is remarkable because of its simplicity. One light placed in exactly the right place, helping people they would never meet. Few inventions have remained so faithful to their original purpose. The materials changed, the fuel changed, the lenses became brighter, the towers grew stronger, electricity replaced flames, automation replaced many of the daily routines of the keeper. Satellites eventually circled the Earth, yet through every generation, the lighthouse continued asking the same quiet question: how can we make the sea just a little safer than it was yesterday? Perhaps that is why these towers continue to capture our imagination. Most buildings exist for the people inside them. Homes shelter families, markets welcome customers, libraries preserve knowledge, churches gather communities, but a lighthouse is different. Its true purpose has always been directed outward, toward strangers, toward travelers, toward ships passing silently in the darkness. Most of the people helped by a lighthouse never entered its doorway, never met its keeper, never learned the names of the engineers who designed it. The greatest success of a lighthouse was often invisible: a ship that never wrecked, a family that returned safely, a voyage completed without incident. History rarely records disasters that never happened, and yet those quiet successes may have numbered in the millions. Imagine for just a moment the countless people whose lives have been touched by these lights. A Phoenician merchant carefully steering toward a distant fire nearly 3,000 years ago, a Roman grain ship arriving safely after crossing the Mediterranean, a Viking longship navigating a rocky coastline, a medieval fishing boat finding its harbor before dawn, a clipper ship returning after months at sea, an immigrant vessel carrying families toward a new life, a modern cargo ship crossing the Atlantic beneath a sky filled with satellites. Different centuries, different languages, different worlds, yet all of them at one time or another searched the horizon for the reassuring presence of a single light. There is something wonderfully human about that image. Throughout history, people have always looked for signs that they were heading in the right direction. Sometimes that guidance came from stars, sometimes from maps, sometimes from the advice of experienced travelers. And sometimes it came from a quiet tower standing patiently beside the sea. Even today, long after GPS transformed navigation, people continue visiting historic lighthouses, not because they need help finding the harbor, but because these places invite us to slow down. There are few buildings where time seems to move quite so gently. The waves continue their endless rhythm, the wind carries the scent of salt across the cliffs, seabirds circle overhead. The lantern turns at its unhurried pace. Standing beside a lighthouse, it becomes surprisingly easy to imagine another century. To picture a keeper climbing the spiral staircase with a lantern in hand, to hear the distant cry of a foghorn rolling across the water, to imagine sailing ships appearing over the horizon one by one, perhaps that is part of their enduring appeal. Lighthouses remind us that progress does not always mean forgetting the past. Sometimes the oldest ideas remain among the very best. A reliable guide and a well-built structure, a community willing to help strangers, these are timeless concepts. As long as people continue traveling across the sea, there will always be something comforting about a familiar light waiting on the shore. And even if one day every ship becomes entirely autonomous, even if navigation grows more accurate than we can currently imagine, it seems unlikely that humanity will ever willingly abandon these remarkable towers. They have become more than tools. They are landmarks, works of art, pieces of history, symbols of perseverance, and quiet reminders that some of the greatest acts of kindness are performed without expectation of recognition somewhere at this very moment. A lighthouse is beginning another evening's work. The sun is slipping below the horizon. The sky is changing from gold to orange to deep shades of blue. The first stars are appearing overhead. Far below, waves continue washing against ancient rocks exactly as they have for countless generations. As darkness settles over the water, a lamp awakens, a great lens begins its slow rotation. A familiar beam sweeps across the sea again and again and again. Perhaps somewhere beyond the horizon, a sailor notices that light. Perhaps someone glances up from the deck of a small fishing boat. Perhaps a family aboard a ferry watches it pass quietly through the night. Or perhaps no one sees it at all. The lighthouse does not know. It simply continues shining, patiently, faithfully, just as it always has.
Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the history of lighthouses.
I hope these stories have carried you peacefully across centuries of maritime history, and perhaps, if sleep has not already found you, may your dreams be calm, your seas be gentle, and may you always find your way home by the light on the shore.